end this morning with this scene in the garden where Jesus was raised. Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them." Mary responds to the glory of the risen Christ by falling before him and clinging to him. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us for sure that she fell and that she grabbed a hold of him, but that phrase that says, "Don't hold on to me," leads me to believe that when Mary realized this was Jesus, who had raised from the dead, that she fell before him, grabbed hold of him. And it's this beautiful posture of humility. It's the posture of worship. And when we come together to worship God, when we realize the majesty of His presence, and when we acknowledge that, when we bring it into our awareness, we can't help but just fall before Him and worship. In our study of singing in worship, we considered how we bow our hearts before the Lord with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And in our study of the Lord's Supper, we considered how we bow our hearts before the Lord in remembrance and in self-examination. And now we are having a study of worshipful giving. And we consider how we bow before the Lord, offering our wealth and money and possessions. Now, if we think of giving as just a charitable act to bless other people, it's worthwhile just on that level. To think about giving to help the poor, the needy, to alleviate suffering, says something about our own selflessness by being willing to depart with the things that we have in order to bless someone else. This is the season of gift giving, and so our hearts are a little more willing to give and to bless other people. And on that level, it all is wonderful and good. But think about giving as worship, and it makes it a little deeper. It makes it more spiritual. It means that I'm making a statement to cast my life before God, trusting in Him to take care of me, even as I relinquish the things that I have for His glory and His praise. It's an act of worship. It's something I do not just to be charitable, but to be worshipful. And that changes the way that I give. Now, I almost decided to not do this lesson today for two reasons: because it's a very difficult parable and because everyone's here for Thanksgiving, and I'm glad you're here. But I began to reconsider, and I thought, if there was ever a time to have a lesson on giving, it would be around the season of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. A time when we are thankful for what we have, but thankful for what we have. And as we count our blessings, we are encouraged to be givers, to give more, because we have a greater acknowledgement of how thankful we are for what we have. And that should lead us then, as we worship and we bow before God, that we bow before Him with our giving as well. And in these lessons, we're considering our attitude towards money and possessions, Jesus' teachings, tithing throughout the Bible, and some New Testament guide passages. I have about 8 or 9 lessons here, but if it runs its course sooner, we'll move on. Today we are continuing in Jesus' teachings. Jesus has more to say about wealth, money, and possessions than any other topic except the kingdom of heaven. I've had this slide up here every time we've had this topic so far, just for you to notice and to see that this is not an obscure topic. This is not something we find once or twice in Jesus' teachings. But Time and time again, we find it because Jesus knew for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now let's turn to Luke chapter 16 for our text today, and we're going to read verses 1 through 13. Luke chapter 16. I'm using the NIV version today. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. The manager said to him, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, this parable is somewhat difficult to understand, and at the same time is really easy to misunderstand. It's why I almost skipped it, because I thought this is difficult for me to grasp. But I think with this explanation today, you can leave today with a blessing. Let's consider this as an outline then. First, let's talk about a manager, the unrighteous manager, the teaching in this parable for the disciples, the teaching for the Pharisees, and then the teaching for all time. First, just the concept of a manager. Jesus often teaches about disciples' relationship with money in terms of management. Now, I'm choosing management, that's the NIV word. Some would use the word stewardship. That word has kind of been hijacked, and so I decided not to use it because you may relate it to another lesson or people that you've heard speak on it. I want to talk about it in terms of management. If you think about management I was going to use something more modern, but let's just take the time period for which it was written, the first century. Okay, you might have the master's house. The master's wealthy. He has property. He has flocks, if you will, or he has herds, or he has crops. Whatever it may be, I drew some green lines here to pretend maybe it's crops. And he has hired a manager. The manager lives on the property. He doesn't own anything. He doesn't even own the house in which he lives. He lives in the house that belongs to the master. The master's house is there on the property as well. And he manages the property, the crops, the workers, the collection, harvest, the selling, everything with regards to this business, this land that belongs to the master. The manager manages. He owns nothing. Now think about it. This is the imagery of who we are. Managers. It's all God's. We are managers. the first truth. Everything belongs to the master. If the manager begins to believe that everything belongs to him, there's a problem. Because then he may mismanage the things that really belong to the master. He may extort things. He may steal things. He may think that they're really his, when in reality it all belongs to the master. The manager oversees the master's wealth, money, and possessions. It's all his. Here are some spiritual thoughts then with regard to the idea of being a manager. All that we have comes from and belongs to God. God grants little to some to many, and much to few. God expects us to wisely manage the money, possessions, talents, and opportunities that He gives us. And keeping the perspective of a manager changes the way we live our lives. It's not as hard to let go of someone else's money, maybe. The Lord's desire is that His managers use His possessions with honesty and hard work and generosity. Consider these passages from the Old Testament. Proverbs 3 and verse 9, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your crops. Proverbs 11 and verse 1, the Lord abhors dishonest scales, but accurate weights are His delight. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 10, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. And Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 12, wisdom is as a shelter, as money is a shelter, but the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves those who have it. Now going back to the parable, number 2, the unrighteous manager. Now this is what made the difference in the parable for me. Let's go to the next slide. Jesus does not use the unrighteous manager's dishonesty as something to be copied. When you read it, you think, oh, He says, well, go out and be dishonest with people so you can take advantage of them so you can do good things. It's not saying that at all. Rather, He holds out this dishonest manager as an example of the way the world works. This is the way the world works. The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are people of the light. The unrighteous know how to use money for unrighteous advantages, buying off friends, acting shrewdly in business dealings, or clever in negotiating. That's the way the world works. Jesus urges the disciples to learn something important from the ways that the shrewd business people of the world work. Learn something from them. And therefore that takes us to the next point, and that is the teaching for the disciples. As they look then at these unrighteous people who act shrewdly for unrighteous advantages, what can you learn from that in the way they are doing business that could be something learned for righteousness? Not the dishonesty and the things that are wrong, but just the idea that they're actually doing something to further their work. So here then is the teaching for the disciples. The unrighteous are skilled in using money for their unrighteous purposes. Jesus urges the righteous to be skilled in using money for righteous purposes. The righteous ought to use money to further the kingdom. That's the central message here. Think of how your giving can impact the world for righteousness. Think of what you can do if you use the money, the possessions, the opportunities that God has given you, disciple, for righteous purposes. Keep your eyes open for those things and have a heart that's willing to be open in the giving for those purposes. Now we may want to excuse ourselves and say, I sure hope the wealthy heard that. But let's just take a step back and look at this. Did you know that 39% of the world's wealth belongs to the United States? This, by the way, is from 2010, and with the currently good economy, it may even be much greater than this. Western Europe accounts for another 31%. So if you add the United States, Canada, and Europe, we have 70% of the world's wealth. That leaves only 30 for everybody else in the whole world to share 30%. We're all wealthy, which means we're blessed. This message is for me. And so here's that difficult to understand if you don't place it in the context that I've just outlined. Verse 9, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. It's gone. You've given it away. You've used it. Not to manipulate friends, but to cultivate and to develop relationships and friendships, and to use the opportunities that come with the money that we've been given in order to further the cause of Christ. It's not about us. It's not for self-importance or self-gain. It's to uplift and uphold Christ. It's to worship Him. And so I've written here, this is not a call to manipulate people or throw money around or to purchase friends. Rather, it is a call to think properly about the reason that God has loaned us His money and His possessions for our management. Why has God made us wealthy? Why? He loves us? Yes. But why has He allowed us to be the wealthiest people? It's to expand our opportunities to worship Him with our money. Not so we can have a lot more things. It's to give us doors that are open to worship Him with the things that we have and to further the kingdom of heaven. It is a call to consider the doors that can be opened to the gospel for those shrewd enough to see them and to walk through them with the blessings financially that God has brought to us. Now, I will put this little aside here, which I have done in the last few weeks. I don't say these things to us because we are bad givers. I think this congregation is full of great givers. But I say these things because I want us to be worshipful givers. It's different. It's more. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? The disciple who coasts through life making money for himself, spending on himself, and missing the opportunities to shrewdly use his wealth for eternal purposes has mismanaged his master's wealth. Imagine the hungry fed, the gospel spread, the Bible read. If disciples shrewdly managed wealth and possessions for the furtherance of the kingdom of heaven. Imagine. Number 4, the teaching for the Pharisees. In verses 14 and 15, continuing, Jesus says to the Pharisees who loved money, they heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. And He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. The Pharisees see Jesus' teaching as buffoonery, and they sneer at it. And Jesus calls out their love of money, assuring them that God knows their hearts. And that's where this all begins, doesn't it? It begins deep from within. It begins at our core. It comes from who we really are in our hearts. The love of money can creep up on us unawares. It can overtake our hearts. It's just something that we need to be alerted to. I thought this was sad, almost humorous, but in a way sad. Let's go to the next slide. This was a research that was done. They interviewed people and said, what would you be willing to do for $10 million? 25% said they would abandon their family for $10 million. 25% said they would abandon their church. 16% said they would give up their American citizenship. 16% said they would leave their spouse for $10 million. 10% said they would withhold testimony and let a murderer go free. 7% said they would kill a stranger. And 3% said they'd put their children up for adoption. I thought that one might be higher. I didn't know. So. I'm kidding. Isn't it something? Think about that. How enticing money is. What then is the teaching for all time? The teaching for all time is clear and unmistakable. You cannot serve both God and money. But you know what? We can serve God with our money. And we can worship God with our money. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will, now notice this, hold to the one. Now let's think about this. Where did we start this lesson? Where did we start it? Mary Magdalene, she worships Jesus. She sees him. She grabs a hold of him, holding on to him. And we have this contrast now here at the end of the lesson where Jesus says, you're going to hold on to something. What are you going to hold on to? Are you going to hold on to Jesus, or are you going to hold on to the money? You got to choose. You cannot serve God and mammon. This is from the King James Version. I like the King James Version, hold. The NIV says devoted. It takes us back to the beginning of the lesson where Mary Magdalene held on to Jesus. It offers up a choice of whom or what we worship, the Lord or wealth. To what will we hold? The bottom line today is this. What is the reason that God has loaned us his money and possessions for our management? Why are we given so much? And will we manage his wealth for the treasures of eternity? Are we managing his money to advance the kingdom of heaven? I'm glad I didn't skip this parable because it's challenged me myself to evaluate and to ask, why has God given me so much? And will I manage his things as he would want me to? Let's be thankful this Thanksgiving, and let's be great givers. If you'd like to respond this morning, please come as we stand and sing.